Hi again, everybody. This is a new chapter, and again, this is a chapter that I've split into two parts just because, really, due to its importance, I'd rather separate it out so you could take time to go through part one, then separately take a look at part two rather than trying to go through everything at once. There's a lot of important components to this chapter and the overall topic of what is the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, or the aggregate demand, aggregate supply diagram, it's sometimes called. And so, having spent some time developing the aggregate expenditures model, that's very useful to us, that understanding of how GDP is a function of those four levels of spending, and how changes in spending drive changes in GDP. And again, the multiplier effect is very important to understanding that relationship. Having developed all that, it's time to move on to a new model. And really, to my mind, there's two reasons for doing this. One is that the aggregate demand, aggregate supply diagram helps us improve our understanding of how an economy works. Because, first of all, in this model, we include the price level. And that was really a flaw, if you like, from the aggregate expenditures model, that we didn't know what was going on with prices. In fact, it assumes prices were fixed. And one of the variables that we're really interested in terms of understanding the economy that we've discussed is inflation, the general price level. So this model, on the vertical axis, reveals the price level and changes in the price level as the economy is changing. So that's the first real benefit of doing this model. We can also track changes in the price level so we can see what's going on with inflation. The other advantage is that we can also show where full employment level of GDP is. Again, in the aggregate expenditures model, we could make some assumptions, assume that we know where full employment is. Then we talked about recessionary and inflationary gaps. But explicitly in the aggregate demand, aggregate supply diagram, we know where full employment is. So it helps us understand not only the current equilibrium level of GDP, but also the full employment level, which again is the goal. So we can see where we are and where we want to be. And that helps us with that final step of trying to understand how we can move from where we are to where we want to be. We can see both levels of GDP on the diagram. So that helps us with that final policy step. So what we're going to do here is just, first of all, introduce the concepts of aggregate demand, aggregate supply, explain both curves and why they look the way they do, and then talk about our equilibrium again. So using this diagram, how do we determine the equilibrium level of GDP? But also, again, because price is on this diagram, the equilibrium price level. And then we move on, again, similar to how we develop the aggregate expenditures model, we move on to look at the effects of changes, in this case, changes in aggregate demand and aggregate supply, and how that affects our equilibrium, real GDP, and price level. So this is what we call a variable price, variable output model, where, again, unlike the aggregate expenditures model, where prices were assumed to be fixed, here we'll see prices can change. And so that's a big improvement, really, over the aggregate expenditures model. And as we move forward, we think about the aggregate supply curve, we'll see that we can really look at this in different time periods. Specifically, we can look at what's called the immediate short run, the short run, or the long run. And I'll talk about those different time periods and what they mean. Actually, in the analysis, we tend just to focus on the short run, but I'll explain the different time periods anyway. So this is a new model. It's a different model. Yet it takes a lot of what we've already developed. Again, spending drives GDP. Again, the multiplier is important. So everything we've discussed so far still holds. It's just a new model to show us how the economy works and how the economy reacts to changes in spending levels. So again, it's called the aggregate demand, aggregate supply diagram. So, like we do with demand and supply, like you would have done in micro, let's take them separately and then put them together. So here, again, we're not dealing with micro concepts. We're not dealing with the demand for Coca-Cola or the supply of pizza. We're dealing with aggregate demand and aggregate supply, the demand for all goods and services in the US and the production of all goods and services in the US. So we're dealing with the aggregate demand, aggregate supply diagram. So what I want to do first of all, and in a lot of text, this is often just an appendix or sometimes not even discussed, but I think it's important to show you how the aggregate demand curve is really just derived from what we've already developed. The aggregate demand curve is derived from the aggregate expenditures model. And so what I do here is, as you can see, with these two diagrams, the top diagram is our aggregate expenditures model. So everything that we've learned so far. And underneath we have this new aggregate demand curve that we're going to talk about. So again, here with the aggregate expenditures model, we are graphing total spending, C plus I plus G plus X, or XN, against different levels of real GDP. And here's our three spending lines we have here. Underneath, we've got this new aggregate demand curve. Here we're graphing price, so here's the price level coming into the diagram, price against different levels of real GDP. And so what we can do is show up from what we have learned up here in terms of our aggregate expenditures model, show how this derives this aggregate demand curve underneath. Again, the vertical axes of both are our variable of interest, real GDP. So we're deriving the aggregate demand curve from the aggregate expenditures model. And so let's start somewhere. Let's pick a price. So we're down here, and we're going to pick a price. We've got to start somewhere. Let's pick this price P1. So out there in the economy, we have just this P1 general price level. And so based on this price level, we'll be spending, again, collectively, C, I, G, and XN, we'll be spending some level of money, of some expenditures. So this is depicted by this top aggregate expenditures line right here. So AE1 at P1. So when the price level is P1, here's how much money we're spending as depicted on this aggregate expenditures line. So as we know, there'll be an equilibrium. Equilibrium is right here, where that's the only point the spending line crosses the 45-degree line. So spending is equal to real GDP at that point. So again, we know we can find this equilibrium, bring it down, and right now in our economy, when the price level is P1 and we're spending this AE1, real GDP production is Q1. So what I'm doing is using the aggregate expenditures model to find our equilibrium level of GDP. So down here on our new diagram, when the price level is P1, I know, having shown this up top, that the output level right now will be Q1. So this must be a point right here, this 1 prime. This is our point. When the price level is P1, production will be Q1. So that's our first point. Okay, so what happens if we change the price level? Let's go ahead and increase the price level. Increase the price level to P2, and what we'd expect to see in terms of spending is that spending will go down. So the aggregate expenditure line should shift down because purchasing power of wealth falls, or interest rates may rise, net exports may fall, but as the price level goes up, we expect to see a decrease in spending in the economy. So as the price level goes up to P2, our spending line here will shift down. So we have this new spending line that we call AE2. And again, this spending line corresponds to this new P2 higher price level in the economy. So now we're moving along this spending line. But again, we're going to find an equilibrium, and our equilibrium is right here. So when the price level in the economy is P2, our new equilibrium level of GDP is Q2. So that gives us a new point down here in our new diagram. Again, the price level is P2. Through the aggregate expenditures model, we find out that equilibrium GDP will be Q2. So this point here, 2 prime, is our second point on our new diagram. Then finally, we just do it one more time. Again, we can go ahead and increase the price level. Again, so this is depicting inflation, more inflation in the economy. Goods and services are becoming more expensive. Again, we expect the aggregate expenditures in the economy to fall, so the aggregate expenditure line will shift down. So now we move along this lower aggregate expenditures line, AE3. Again, AE3 when the price level is P3, giving us our equilibrium GDP right here of Q3. So again, down here, when the price level is P3, we know equilibrium GDP will be Q3. So it's a third point here. So we have these 3 points all relating the price level to the equilibrium level of GDP. And if we put a line through those 3 points, that is the aggregate demand curve. So the aggregate demand curve is found by just drawing a line through the 3 points that we generated. These 3 points we found, different price levels, different levels of real GDP. So this is the starting point for our new analysis. Here we're going to talk about and think about this aggregate demand curve. Well, that's where it comes from. So I think it's worthwhile spending those 5 minutes or so just to get an understanding when we look at an aggregate demand curve, how it's derived. So again, it's derived from the aggregate expenditures model and changes in spending, and again, the multiplier effects in there, the things that we've talked about. So the aggregate demand curve, as we've now derived it, is the schedule or a curve. So graphically, we'll look at it, call it a curve, that shows the different levels of real GDP that domestic and foreign buyers desire to purchase at different possible price levels. So it shows us this relationship between the price level in the US economy and the level of real GDP. And we see that it's an inverse relationship. So it's a downward sloping curve. So higher price levels correspond to lower levels of real GDP, and lower price levels correspond to higher levels of real GDP. And so to explain that inverse relationship between the price level and real GDP, there are 3 main effects that drive that inverse relationship. The first one's called the real balances effect. And this all revolves around purchasing power. So how many units of a good can I afford to buy? That's a measure of my purchasing power. So when the price level goes down, so again, that's the price level generally in the economy, so generally things become cheaper, then my purchasing power goes up. I can afford to buy more of those things. I can go out and afford to buy more bread and go to the movies more often and take more trips. When the price level goes down, my purchasing power goes up. Therefore, I can spend more money. So that's the real balances effect. When the price level goes down, purchasing power goes up, and therefore spending can increase. So again, an inverse relationship between the price level and spending in the economy. So the second potential effect is called the interest rate effect. I'm going to talk more about interest rates in the next chapter, where we think about government policy, we think about the Federal Reserve. But essentially, if the price level in the economy goes down, then we may see an increase in interest rates. And again, I haven't really got to the point where I can fully explain that right now, but we will get there. But essentially, if the price level goes down, then demand for money will fall. The amount of money that people wish to hold will go down. And in our money market, which is just the demand and supply of money, a leftward shift in the demand curve, assuming that the money supply is fixed, will cause interest rates to go down. And if interest rates go down, again, we'll see when we look at monetary policy, we should expect to see an increase in some levels of spending, principally business spending, because the interest rate is just the cost of borrowing money. So if interest rates fall, that encourages more people to, say, go to a bank and take out a loan and go and buy something. So that's the interest rate effect. And again, overall, a decrease in the price level causes an increase in spending. Finally, we've got the foreign purchases effect. So again, thinking of a decrease in the price level, ceteris paribus, everything else stays the same. If prices of goods generally in the United States falls compared to goods and services produced in other countries, that should increase spending on US goods, so US exports should rise. Also, conversely, spending on foreign goods, imports into the US, will go down. So you think of XN, net export spending, that's going to be going up. So the price level in US falls, spending on US goods and services should rise. So 3 reasons why you expect to see this downward sloping aggregate demand curve. 3 reasons when the price level, let's say, goes up, spending on real GDP goes down, price level goes down, the aggregate demand will increase. So here we're just moving along the aggregate demand curve, showing lower and higher levels of spending, C, I, G, and X, which is all contained within that aggregate demand curve. So, what are the determinants of aggregate demand then? What can, as we'll see, shift that aggregate demand curve? Well, again, it's all about spending. Those variables we've already talked about. So, number 1, changes in consumer spending. We've talked about why consumer spending might increase or decrease, the wealth effect, expectations, debt, and taxation. We've mentioned these things. Again, if we see a change in consumer spending, ceteris paribus, holding the price level the same, that's going to shift our aggregate demand curve. And as we'll see, if there's an increase in spending, the aggregate demand curve will shift to the right. If there's a decrease in spending, the aggregate demand curve will shift to the left. Investment spending, again, we're just looking at the 4 levels of spending and saying if they change, holding the price level constant, the aggregate demand curve is going to shift. We've talked about investment spending. Again, this is businesses buying goods from other businesses. If that changes, the aggregate demand curve is going to shift. So, for example, if the interest rate changes, as we just mentioned, let's say the interest rate goes down. Again, that's the cost of borrowing money. That is going to perhaps induce businesses to go out and borrow more money and then go out and buy a new piece of machinery or a new delivery vehicle. Again, that's contained in investment spending, so investment spending should go up. The aggregate demand curve would shift to the right. If investment spending falls, the aggregate demand curve will shift to the left. Changes in government spending, G, again for the same reason. It doesn't matter which of the 4 levels of spending are changing. If they change, the aggregate demand curve will shift. So if we see an increase in G, the aggregate demand curve will shift to the right. A decrease in G, aggregate demand curve will shift to the left. And then the same thing for net export spending. Again, keeping the price level the same. If for some reason US exports rise, therefore net export spending goes up, aggregate demand curve will shift to the right. Net export spending goes down, aggregate demand curve will shift to the left. So now I want to think a bit about shifting this aggregate demand curve. So again, it's all about just changes in our 4 levels of spending. How does it work exactly? Again, just like with the aggregate expenditures model, what's important in understanding how the change in aggregate demand influences real GDP is a multiplier effect. So really, the aggregate demand curve shifts in 2 stages. The first stage is, okay, well, what's happening to spending? Is it going up or going down? Again, if C, I, G, or NX, or some combination of the 4 increase, aggregate demand curve will shift to the right. So that's step 1. That's the first stage. But then to understand how that influences GDP, again, you've got to have the multiplier effect. So that's the second step, where we utilize the multiplier effect. So overall, when the aggregate demand curve shifts, it shifts in this 2 stages. By however much spending is changed by, that's the first shift, and you multiply that by this multiplier value to give the overall shift. So again, it's just the change in spending times the multiplier, which again is what we discussed with the aggregate expenditures model. So graphically, here's what it looks like. So if you look down here, here's our aggregate demand curve. And I can see the aggregate demand curve is shifting to the right. Notice the price level is staying the same at P1. The aggregate demand curve, I can see, is shifting from AD1 over here to AD2. It's shifting to the right, so I know that spending must have gone up. You'll notice the dashed aggregate demand curve here. This is depicting the 2 stages. So we get the first shift due to the change in spending, and then the overall shift, the big shift, is the change in spending times the multiplier. Again, we can use the aggregate expenditures model to help us understand what's going on here. So if we look at the AE model, again, here's our original level of GDP, where the aggregate expenditures line is crossing this 45-degree line. So right now, here we are, real GDP at Q1. So in the price levels P1, reading off our initial aggregate demand curve, real GDP is Q1. Now we have this increase in spending. We know in terms of the aggregate expenditures model that shifts up the AE line, and we get a new level, equilibrium level of GDP, and that increases real GDP. In this effect is the change in spending times the multiplier, right? So here's the change in spending, the shift in the AE line, multiplied by whatever the multiplier is, shifting real GDP over by the full effect. The same thing down here. Here's the initial shift in the aggregate demand curve, that's due to the change in spending, and then multiply that by M, and we get the full shift in the aggregate demand curve. So this aggregate demand curve shifts in 2 stages. The change in spending, and then times the multiplier. Again, giving us the same change in real GDP as we had up here using the aggregate expenditures model. So that change in aggregate expenditures is multiplied by the multiplier, and the aggregate demand curve shifts, therefore, by more than that change in spending. Again, it's the change in spending times the multiplier. So anytime we shift the demand curve, that's how we'll be doing it. And it's the same for a decrease. If spending decreases, aggregate demand curve shifts to the left in 2 stages. The first shift is just a decrease in spending, and then you multiply that by the value of M to get the full leftward shift in the aggregate demand curve. So the aggregate demand curve could only shift in one of 2 ways, as we're seeing here. So AD1 can shift to the right due to an increase in spending. We call that an increase in aggregate demand. Or it can shift to the left due to a decrease in spending. We call that a decrease in aggregate demand. Again, in both cases, we have this 2-stage shift, the change in spending times the multiplier. often when we do it, when we show this, we don't put in the dashed, the first stage. We just go ahead and we just shift it by the full amount. On the right, just as a little recap, it might be useful just to have a table like this, just to remind ourselves of the determinants of aggregate demand. These are the things, the factors that shift the aggregate demand curve. And again, it's just the change in spending. It's C, I, it's G, or it's NX. And those are the different, some of the variables anyway, that can change those individual levels of spending. So, we'll come back in a while and we'll look at the aggregate demand curve again. So that's just our introduction to give us an idea of what the aggregate demand curve looks like and what makes it shift. Now thinking about the aggregate supply curve, so here we're, of course, flipping to the supply side of the economy. What we see here, again, at different general price levels, what the quantity of goods and services that a nation's firms are willing and able to produce over some period of time, holding everything else constant. So again, we're looking at the relationship between the price level and the total amount of quantity supplied, the aggregate supply. So when thinking about the aggregate supply, again, as I mentioned earlier, there are these different time periods that we must consider. And essentially there are 3 time periods that we talk about. And the overall relationship of production of goods and services to the price level depends on our assumptions of the input prices and output prices. So input prices, well, inputs generally are the resources that a company uses to produce the good. So it could be raw materials or it could be labor, for example. So those are the inputs. So the price of labor is wages. Output prices are just the prices of the goods that the company produces. So what assumptions do we make about these prices and whether they are fixed or whether they are flexible? Well, as we'll see, that changes over time. So let's start at the nearest point in time, which we call the immediate short run. So right now. So we're thinking about a company producing goods, and right now we assume that both input and output prices are fixed. So the prices of the resources that the company uses to produce the good and the prices of the company's goods themselves are fixed. And this is the immediate short run. So how long does the immediate short run last? Well, we can't say. It could be days, weeks, months. There's no fixed time set in stone. What we know that is that the immediate short run lasts as long as this is true, as long as both input and output prices stay fixed. If that's true, we're in the immediate short run. So why are we making this assumption? Why make input prices be fixed? Well, lots of input prices are fixed by some contractual agreement. Again, we mentioned labor. Labor is an input, a resource into producing the good. And a large percentage, about 75% typically, of a firm's total cost of producing a good are wages. So wages are the most important of all the inputs. And often wages are set contractually. So typically a worker goes to the firm and has a year-long contract. So I'm going to work for a year, here's my contract, I sign it, it specifies how much money I'm going to earn, so my wages are fixed. So there's nothing the firm can do about that. For that period of time, my wages and the wages of the other workers are fixed. That's a fixed input. The price of that input is fixed, it's set in stone for as long as that contract lasts. Output prices might be fixed too. So, for example, you can think about we're producing a good and we put out a catalogue, and in the catalogue we have all our goods, so pictures of all these goods and all the prices underneath. Well, this price list is fixed in a sense as long as that period of time lasts. So it could be a fall catalogue, so the prices are fixed for at least that season. The firm's not going to go in and change the the prices in its catalog. So output prices can also be fixed. That is, firms will fix the prices for customers, and then we agree as a firm to supply a certain quantity at that fixed price. So in the immediate short run, input prices are fixed and output prices are fixed. So if that's the case, when we're looking at the aggregate supply curve in the immediate short run, so this ISR, the aggregate supply in the immediate short run, to show it graphically, it'll just be a horizontal line. Right? The vertical axis is the price level, and our horizontal axis is real GDP, the production level. So we're just changing how much we supply at a fixed price. The aggregate supply curve in the immediate short run will be horizontal at the current price level. So the output supply depends on spending at the current price level. So when we draw it, here it is coming in right here. This is our immediate short run aggregate supply curve. Here's our price level, P1. As we can see, at that price, we choose as an economy how much to supply at that one price level. The price levels are fixed right now, therefore the price level does not vary. The aggregate supply curve in the immediate short run will be horizontal. So once we move beyond the immediate short run, we get into a time period that we call the short run. So the difference is, in the short run, now firms can respond to more spending on their goods by not only increasing production, but also by pushing up the price level too. So in the short run, what we tend to see are input prices are fixed or inflexible, but now output prices are variable. And so the short run aggregate supply curve, so the aggregate supply curve looks like this. It's upward sloping. So this is the short run aggregate supply curve. And as you can see, as we're moving to the right, we are increasing aggregate supply, moving to the right. So real GDP is going up. But also, as we're going to the right, we're also beginning to move up. So the price level is now rising. And just as some notation, this QF that you see, this is the full employment level of output. So again, one of the advantages that I mentioned of the aggregate demand, aggregate supply diagram is that the full employment level of output is shown on the diagram. So right now, we've left the immediate short run and we're entering this short run period. And we're going to see in the notes in a second why the aggregate supply curve is now upward sloping. Also note that it's not a constant slope. The aggregate supply curve, as we move into the right, as we're producing more and more and more, is getting steeper and steeper and steeper. And there's a reason for that I'll discuss. So why does the aggregate supply curve in the short run slope upwards? It's really just a case of the firms taking advantage of profits per unit. So what are profits per unit? Profit per unit is the price that the firm can sell their good for minus the cost of making the good. So that's the profit they make from each unit. So, for example, if I can produce a good for $10, sell it for $35, my profit per unit is $25. And while these per unit costs, the costs per unit typically are fixed, if not highly inflexible, like wages we talked about, then if the product price goes up and the costs are staying the same, then the per unit profits will be rising. And if per unit profits rise, we think the firm will want to produce more. We should see an increase in the aggregate supply. Conversely, if prices are falling, again, those are output prices, if they are falling, yet the cost of producing the good stay the same, then profit per unit will be going down, so firms will reduce their production levels. So the reason that the aggregate supply curve in the short run is upward sloping, we see this positive relationship between the price level and real GDP. Again, it's because if the price level goes up, that's going to pull up profit per unit. Companies want to produce more. That's an increase in real GDP. If the price level goes down, that's going to cut into a company's profit per unit. Therefore, we expect they'll decrease production. So we'll see a decrease in real GDP produced. Again, as I mentioned, this relationship, though, is not constant. The slope of the aggregate supply curve changes over time. As we're moving to the right, it's getting steeper and steeper and steeper. That increase in the slope picks up, especially after the full employment level of GDP, and there's a reason for that. So let's think about what's happening with this diagram. So if I go back to this diagram, so what's happening here? So let's say we're down here with this part of the aggregate supply curve. So the current level of production is below full employment level of output. What does that mean exactly? Well, that means the economy's not doing very well. We're producing below the full employment level of output. So you can think for individual firms that they're going to have perhaps these machines just what we would call lying idle, just machinery not turned on. We've laid workers off as the economy went into a recession. Let's say now things are beginning to pick up. Spending on our goods is rising. So we're beginning to produce more. So real GDP is beginning to rise. So we're sort of moving along the aggregate supply curve here. Well, at this point in the economy, when you're producing significantly below the full employment level, it's relatively easy at this point to increase production. Again, you've got machines. All you need to do is just turn the machines on and then pick up the telephone and call your old workers and say, hey, you want to come back and get your job back? Things are picking up again. So what's important here is that at this point, when we're along this, again, lower part of the average supply curve, workers, for example, at this point aren't going to demand more money. Once you pull out of a recession, there's very little upward pressure on the cost of producing the good. Again, wages being the main determinant of the cost of production. Workers at this point are very unlikely to try and bargain to get some increase in their wages. People are just happy to be working. So we can increase output, but there's very little upward pressure on the price level. If we keep increasing output, we keep moving along to the right, if spending on our goods keeps going up, we get here close or at full employment, well, now things just become more difficult. It's more difficult now to keep producing more and more as the economy gets to or even goes past full employment. Because now all my machines are running, and now I've hired back all my old workers. If I want to increase production further, then things are going to have to change. So what I might have to do, for example, is hire a bunch of new workers. Well, they haven't been trained on these machines. That takes time for me to train them up. And that could be expensive. I'm paying them just for training. I'm not producing anything. So that's now perhaps my cost of production start to rise. Or if I just want to use my existing workforce, well, if I want them to come in perhaps on the weekend and work to increase production, well, that's going to require overtime. So I can still at this point increase production. So we can still keep moving to the right. That's how we can actually go beyond full employment. But and in doing so, now there's pressure on the cost of production. Now I have to pay workers more. But if people out there are still spending money on my goods and services, well, now the natural reaction is for the price level to really start rising. In response to the extra cost of producing these goods over time, for example, now the prices of the goods we're producing will start to rise. So here we see that input costs are perhaps rising more rapidly than output. So the result is we're getting this rapid rise in per unit production costs and that gives the short-run aggregate supply curve its rapidly increasing slope, especially as GDP goes past full employment. So that's what I'm suggesting here, that things begin to change. So the aggregate supply curve in the short run gets steeper and steeper. Once the economy goes beyond full employment, now most of the resources are already employed and per unit costs rise quicker than output. So the slope of the aggregate supply curve in the short run increases at an increasing rate. Okay, so finally, we enter what's called the long run. So at some point in time, both input prices and output prices are highly flexible. And that's the time period when we enter the long run. And we'll see in the long run, the aggregate supply curve, the ASLR, the long run aggregate supply curve, is vertical at the full employment level of real GDP. Again, in the long run, you cannot produce more than the economy's potential. You can in the short run. For some period of time, we can produce more than the economy's full employment level output. But in the long run, the level of aggregate supply is fixed at the full employment level of GDP. And that's because in the long run, what we'll see is wages and other input prices, but principally wages, are variable, and they will change to match the change in the price level. And it's this flexibility in principally wages in the long run that moves the economy back to full employment. So first of all, just a graphic, that's what it looks like. Again, it's the long run aggregate supply curve. Again, vertical at the level of full employment. So why is it vertical at the full employment level of output? Well, we'll see that price level changes do not affect the firm's profits, and therefore they don't create any incentive for firms to change their output. And so the economy in the long run will always produce the full employment level of output, irrespective of the price level, because profits will always adjust to give the firms exactly this right profit incentive to produce exactly the full employment output level. So that might be a little confusing. So let's try and explain that. Let's try and explain it with an example. Let's say right now we're going to start out, we're in the short run and we're at full employment. So we're producing the full employment level of output, and the price level right now is 100. Okay, what would happen if prices of outputs, so the firm's output prices doubles? So now the price doubles to 200. Well, thinking again about profit per unit, that would increase, right? If the selling price doubles, the cost of production stay the same, profits must rise. So profits in the short run rise, which is the encouragement for firms, the incentive for firms to produce more. As we said, it really all is about profit per unit. So if profit per unit is going up, firms will want to produce more. However, this is dependent on, right now, input prices being fixed in the short run. But in the long run, when all of the firm's input prices can change, firms can only produce beyond full employment by running their company at higher rates, i.e. hiring more workers. So this creates more demand for labor, for example. So we're increasing demand for a constrained resource, like the number of workers. And as the input prices, such as wages, in the long run can change, then the increase in demand for workers will increase the price of the input. So as we're producing more and more, and we're hiring more workers, at some point, i.e. in the long run, wages will start to rise. So the excess demand for the resource is going to push up the price. So now wages will be rising. And so the firm's profits begin to go down. As we're producing more, we're having to pay our workers more, the profit per unit starts to fall. And therefore, if the profit per units or profits per unit start to go down, then so does that incentive to produce more than the full employment level of GDP. So this process of rising input prices, wages, and therefore falling per unit profits, that continues until the increase in wages or the input price exactly matches that initial change in output prices. So again, if output prices initially double, causing the firms to produce more, that pushes up wages, and wages will start to rise. Eventually the wages will double, and the firm's real profits go back to exactly where they were. If output prices double and then production costs double, the firm's real profits will return to where they were before there was any change. So again, we'll move back to the full employment level of GDP. So in the long run, GDP is fixed at the full employment level of GDP because again, we have this flexibility in principally the input prices. So we have these three different time periods, and to my mind, there's obviously this benefit of understanding the three different time periods, but we really focus on just the short run. So it's really just the short run time period that's important to us. As we move forward and we talk about the model and we use the model to understand government policy, it's the short run that's going to be important to us. So in the second part of this chapter, the next set of slides, we're going to put the aggregate demand curve and the aggregate supply curve together, look at the equilibrium level of GDP, and then talk more about this full aggregate demand, aggregate supply diagram. Again, we'll talk about recessions and periods of inflation and try and get a better idea of what those variables mean.